Hi everyone. So last year at college for a history final, we were told we could pick any topic we wanted to talk about as long as it was between the years of 1828 and 1877 for a presentation. These were important decades for the United States. There was industrialization, expansion, the abolition and feminist movements were gaining momentum. There was this little thing called the Civil War, where a bunch of states wanted to preserve and expand the right to own people. It really was that simple. I originally wrote down a whole bunch of quotes from every single article of secession from every state and declarations from Confederacy Vice President Alexander Stephens saying that slavery was the literal cause of secession. I mean, he calls it a revolution in the quote. And even diary entries from soldiers on the ground. They knew what they were fighting for. It was for slavery. At this point, you have to work desperately hard to find any reason why it wasn't about slavery. But that was going to take too much time in the video, so I put them in the description. So, for the final presentation for school, I wanted to do something more fun, more lighthearted. I wanted to talk about American science fiction, and it was a lot of fun. If anyone wants a more in-depth video on what I found, let me know in the comments. I'll turn my original paper into a video. In my research, I found so much I didn't expect, a slew of short stories and novels, including the reason why you clicked on this video. I found The Princess of the Moon, a Confederacy fairy tale written in 1869 by Cora Ives. She was the sister to Confederacy Senator Thomas Semmes of Louisiana, whom was an advisor for Confederacy President Jefferson Davis. She was also the wife of Confederacy Colonel Joseph Ives. Cora Ives was someone who was in one of the most comfortable and privileged positions that you could be in at that time. Wealthy, high on the social ladder, entertaining equally high-profile guests. She probably would have lived that type of life till her death if the South won, which they did not. She wrote this fairy tale in New York City during the Reconstruction in the South, which was a mess. You lost a war, so what do? Well, if you were in power during this time, you don't have that power anymore. Slaves are now free with rights. There's now a workers' economy and an entirely different social structure instead of a slave-based one, with the northern states regulating the southern states to ensure that no more rebellion will rise again. There was mismanagement and corruption during Reconstruction from the north, and the south, there was resentment and attempts to retroactively change what happened in the Civil War and after, some through terrorist acts from the Ku Klux Klan. Others were through writing. So let's talk about this silly book. I'm dealing with a scanned copy I found on the internet, so bear with me. The book begins with an introduction by Cora on why she wrote the story. Dear little southern readers, when we wish to amuse children, we create in our imagination a race of beings called fairies, and cause them to accomplish as many wonderful things as possible. When my reveries were interrupted by a bevy of dear, barefooted little rebels who, without ceremony, surrounded me and begged for a fairy story. Of course, I could not resist their entreaties, so after assuring them that in reality there exist no such creatures as fairies, I drew upon my fancy for the following story. And I think it's nice that you're writing a story for kids, but I was a little kid and I was just like, can you read me a fairy story? And she's just like, sorry, fairies don't exist, but here's one anyway. I mean, it's kind of like Santa Claus isn't real, but here's A Night Before Christmas. Here we are to learn and practice virtue, which, like the fairies' violets in the story, will become jewels to adorn our crowns in heaven. And when our Father wills that we should suffer through the wickedness of others, we must remember all the time that is he who afflicts us. We should suffer through the wickedness of others, we must remember. Again, you're talking to little kids who have no position in the world before the Confederacy, but Cora did. She completely benefited off of the wickedness of others. In this case, she was the other. Cora goes on again about all the suffering that people who weren't slaves endured during the war. Houses burned down, clothes stolen. But I will tire my little readers if I attempt to describe each one's sufferings. A record has already been made of them, and at the great day of justice, the sorrows as well as the crimes of everyone will be made manifest. I mean, that sounds like a threat at this point, right? Okay then, that's a good start. Let's see how the rest of the story goes. Chapter 1. It was after the dreadful struggle between North and South that a poor Confederate soldier wandered in a wood near the ruins of his once splendid home. He had been indulging his grief at the graves of his fond parents, recalling the proud day when he had buckled on his sword in defense of his native land. So our guy Randolph here, he's a soldier, he's a Confederate soldier coming back, and he's very, very sad. But alas, how different from his sanguine anticipation was the reality, and now as he thought of his bitter disappointment and gazed upon the blackened ruins of his once beautiful home, deep anguish filled his heart. Raising his tearful eyes heavenward, the moon's pensive rays fell upon his face with unusual brilliancy, causing him to exclaim, "Ah, had I wings, how gladly would I seek shelter on your distant, peaceful shores, sweet moon." The moon doesn't have shores, right? Instantly a shadowy mist surrounded him, and through this cloud he beheld a female of exquisite beauty. A crescent of precious stones rested upon her head, from which fell a long veil of silver gauze. "I am the Fairy of the Moon," said she, "and having witnessed your grief, I desire to serve you. What would you have?" So, how long was the fairy watching over suffering going on? Because I could think of just maybe a few other people who were full of grief and anguish and loss that, she could have come down and talked to and given. The soldier fell upon his knees and promised to be her most faithful servant until death if she would only transport him to her dominions, as life in a conquered land had become to him a burden. Yeah, being conquered and taken over kind of sucks, Randolph, doesn't it? That's right, Cato. So she's given him a horse and some rules to follow. "Make good use of the powers I give you, and you shall have my protection." Bear in mind, we don't know what powers were given to him. "But I warn you not to fail to return to this rock, on the first day of every month. The name of your horse is Hope, and whenever you wish to ascend, descend, or stop on your journey, you have only to call Hope. Should you, however, forget me or neglect to visit me at this spot, you will in turn forget the name of your horse and be unable to control his movements. In this I require the explicit obedience of those I serve." Wait, he's serving her, but she's serving him. I mean, that's kind of nice, right? You just have to go and visit this person on a rock once a month. He's going to forget her, isn't he? "And now farewell, mount and leave this land which I have watched over in its prosperity, and now mourn over in its desolation. Yes, young man, I saw the torch applied to your home, and witnessed your noble father's last moment." Okay, so this Fairy of the Moon has been watching over the South for a very long time, apparently, and is calling it prosperity, and she is now mourning over the desolation of the South, and she's pointing out to Randolph's dad dying. She's mourning the death of a slave owner, but not the deaths of the slaves that were dying in the South. It's completely ignored. Randolph inspected his noble steed, finding a pair of snow-white wings under his flowing mane. Okay, so it's a Pegasus. That's cool. I want a Pegasus. He immediately mounted and exclaimed, "Hope!" when, to his delight, the wings gracefully spread themselves, and he found himself flying rapidly through the air. And what was most remarkable, he possessed the power of seeing through space into the interior of the houses and cities he passed. That's cool. Okay, so these are the powers that she talked about but didn't mention until now. Okay, so he goes on and goes through his town and sees a bunch of ruined houses, and then he sees the houses of, viewed the homes of the conquerors, abounding in plenty and decked in the spoils that they had so cruelly acquired. Okay, again, I understand that she's talking to kids who were families of Confederate soldiers and such, and cruelly acquired would be during Reconstruction, but it's just weird to juxtapose that to acquiring people to own. Like, you can't take that away from this. He comes over to the moon, just sees like a really nice place. The air surrounding this new world had upon him a most transporting effect. It being soft and yet exhilarating, the zephyrs made the most beautiful music as they famed the luxuriant foliage, while gentle showers imparting the odor of attar roses constantly moistened the earth. There was no night in this sublime region. There's no night? After wandering many days, he approached a magnificent palace which, from its size and grandeur, he knew must be inhabited by the king, for he had learned on conversing with the people that a king reigned over them who was both wise and good. Alright, so we're gonna learn about the king of the moon. Was the fairy the princess of the moon? I mean, the title is Princess of the Moon, but I guess we'll meet her soon. So Randolph knows that he can't enter the palace without permission, so he just goes on and talks to the people of the moon, which we never really figure out what they look like. I just assume they look like people, but who knows? Randolph was struck with their kind and pleasing manners, and on conversing discovered that such was the peace and content of these people that they had never heard of war and knew nothing of its meaning. His satisfaction was abounded at the thought that he was at last in a country which would never be conquered or even invaded. I mean, that's nice. That the people were free and happy. Well, gee, Randolph, that'd be nice, right? People who are free and happy? Randolph? At last he became tired and was just about to throw himself upon the soft bright turf when he caught a glimpse of what seemed an angel's dream. It was too beautiful for reality, and he was so transfixed with admiration that he had no power to move, and consequently was unable to avoid being seen by the lovely creature who approached him. On beholding him, her face became suffused with blushes, and she was about to retreat, but turning towards him as with a sudden thought, she exclaimed, "Should you be seen here, your death is inevitable. Such must be the fate of any of your sex who look upon me before my marriage, except the one destined by my grandmother to be my husband. He is to appear on my 18th birthday, but until then I am as one dead to the world." Okay then, so the people of the moon don't know anything about war, but they definitely know about death. Anyone who looks upon the princess, who, according to this, is just kind of walking out in the open? That's mean of her. Maybe there should be a war on the moon. They have some reformation to do. "I beg that you will let me have the happiness of sometimes beholding you." I mean, dude, you're kind of playing with fire there. To touch her heart, he told her the history of his life, describing the once happy and prosperous land of his birth, then the misery and ruin brought upon his beloved people by a dreadful war. Last of all, his own despoiled home and his meeting with the good fairy who had taken pity on him. But he did not tell how she had transported him to this place, for he felt he ought to not divulge this secret without first consulting his benefactress. I mean, that's nice. I mean, you don't want to bring Hope into this. I mean, I think Hope is also a guy horse, so I don't want him to die either. On concluding the sad narrative, he discovered the cheeks of the princess were wet with tears, whereupon he again entreated to see her occasionally. "Hey, Randolph, did you ever tell her why you guys fought the war in the first place?" So later on, Randolph goes off exploring. He forgets that he was supposed to meet up with the fairy on the 1st of the month, and he managed to get there in time. Promises to be there a day or two early. And then the fairy raised her wand, and immediately a beautiful clear lake sprang forth at their feet. Its waters, like a mirror, reflected the enchanted bower of the moon in which Randolph had met the princess, and now beheld her again standing near the spot where they had parted. So he's looking down at the water. Her face was pale and sad. She approached the tree against which he had leaned when talking to her, and to his delight he saw her imprint a kiss upon the rough bark. By this he knew she was thinking of him. I mean, she could just like the tree, maybe. What was his astonishment to behold at the same moment the part her sweet lips had touched fall from the tree, and in its place a golden case appeared containing a likeness of himself. That's a weird superpower. Okay. This sight filled him with such happiness that he was on the point of mounting Hope and flying to the moon when the fairy's sweet voice again arrested his attention. Be cautious, she said, how you intrude upon the solitude to which her grandmother has condemned her. Had any other young man presented himself in the enchanted bower as you have done, he would have been punished with instant death. But I watched over you and saved you. I don't know the significance of having to meet at that rock still, since she's watching over him at all times. But okay. Not to mention the death sentence again. That lovely creature is destined for a husband of her grandmother's choice. It is my desire that you should be selected, and I will assist you on condition you continue to obey my order by returning to the appointed time to this place to express your thanks. Kind of sneaky. I mean, like, you're kind of usurping the throne a bit. So she has this long explanation on having to continue to obey her, and then leaves with this threat. But remember that punishment awaits those who disobey me. It's kind of ominous. Mounting his faithful steed, Randolph was in incredibly short time carried to a thick wood near the enchanted bower of the palace. Concealing Hope, he proceeded on foot to find the princess. Dude, you're just playing with fire at this point. The fairy tells you not to do it. The princess tells you not to do it. Since the fairy already threatened, I don't know with what, to, listen to her. I don't know, man. Unconscious of his presence, she was sighing and grieving as she sadly gazed upon the likeness clasped in her hands. But when she saw her lover in person at her feet, her whole countenance became transformed. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds on a rainy day. Okay, so we're finally getting a description on what the princess looks like. Her golden curls fell in graceful profusion over her neck and shoulders. Her soft brown eyes, a moment before so mournful, now beamed upon him with bewitching light. Her ruby lips wreathed in enchanting smiles around teeth that rivaled the rarest pearl, while her pale cheeks became instantly suffused with the tint of the rarest rose. Now this happy pair has passed several hours of each day in sweet communion with each other. Dude, you're not just playing with fire, you're playing with some metaphor for something very big and fiery. Randolph have a death wish? I don't know. He learned that the king had a great passion for music and that aged musicians were permitted to enter the palace when all others of the sex were excluded. Now, Randolph was a proficient in this accomplishment, so he procured a white wig and, having completely disguised his face, presented himself at the palace and was without difficulty admitted into the presence of the king. Alright, so he disguises himself, and now we get to finally meet the king. An imposing monarch sat on the throne of gold inlaid with precious stones, and though pride was marked upon his noble countenance, it was softened by an expression of kindness and benevolence. The queen and their daughter were also present, and when Randolph gazed upon his adored princess, the effect of her resplendent charms was almost too great for his presence of mind. He dared not trust himself to look a second time, lest he should be unable to exercise his musical powers for the pleasure of the king. Okay, so now we know that his powers are see through walls and really good at playing music. Randolph made many inquiries of his name, country, destination, and seeming much interested, Randolph determined to give him a portion of his history. The king was very just, and when he had heard from Randolph of the terrible war in which his countrymen had been engaged, of the many sufferings they had endured before being overpowered by countless hordes of a meddling, peddling race called Yankees. I guess if you call them a different race, it makes it okay. I don't know. Did the king ever ask Randolph why they were fighting the war? In chapter 3, and now Randolph was established at the castle as one of the household, and when not engaged with the king, or teaching and making love to the princess. What? She's not 18 yet, so there's that. I mean, we can talk about the age of consent for the people of the moon, but this is a group of people who know nothing about war and just know peace, and yet are totally fine with the death penalty of just gazing upon the princess, so I don't know what making love's gonna do. So after that detour, Randolph is exploring the palace now, discovering that all this grandeur was the work of a powerful fairy who presided over the destiny of his household. He understood why it was that the king obeyed so implicitly the grandmother's injunctions regarding the princess. The fairy's the grandmother, isn't it? You kind of just said that right there, where like the fairy is watching over everyone and the king listens to the grandmother. The day arrived for their meeting, but the fairy waited in vain at the appointed spot until, unable to restrain her impatience, she touched the rock with her wand, and the lake again appeared, in which was reflected the castle. Seated by the side of the princess, Randolph was apparently forgetful of everything save his own happiness. He was at that moment singing one of his sweetest songs, and the princess was gazing sadly upon him, for she knew that the time was fast approaching when they must part forever, as her grandmother's favorite was to appear on her 18th birthday, which was close at hand. Notwithstanding the apparent difficulties, our hero had determined to act the honorable part of informing the king of his true age and circumstances, trusting to his good fairy's promise and the affection he knew the king entertained for him. Did you inform the king of everything, Randolph? Sadly, the gentle fairy surveyed the picture and commenced to weep, for she well knew that Randolph's forgetfulness of herself would bring trouble upon the happy pair, in spite of her affection for them. Ah, thought she, if he would only come to me, all would yet be right, and my poor granddaughter saved much sorrow. Called it, grandmother is the fairy, but grandma, you know, he did the thing, right? Like we're not going to talk about that. Like, so his only crime is just not meeting up once a month. Like his crime is poor scheduling, not impersonating and sleeping with the princess. Unless I'm completely misinterpreting the term making love in this context, but I think it's a lot funnier to envision it that way, because everything else after this is just, yeah, it's bad. Randolph opened his heart to the good old king, told his unbounded love for his daughter, and the deception it had driven him to practice, and how the promises of the fairy had encouraged him to hope for success. But, as dearly as the king loved him, he dared not disobey the wishes of the grandmother, and with sad heart he gave orders that his favorite musician should die at sunset. And for the first time, sorrow and distress reigned throughout the castle. All the other deaths that the king would go do were not, there were no sorrow and there was no distress. I don't know. It's like I'm not invested. Randolph is about to be executed again because he can't keep his appointment straight, not sleeping with the underage princess of the kingdom. Okay then. He asks if he can embrace his horse one more time. The scene was so touching that there was a murmur of sympathy through the crowd. Suddenly Randolph perceived a gleam of encouragement in Hope's eyes, and he exclaimed imploringly to the king, "Permit me, sire, to take a farewell ride on my beloved horse in your presence in front of the castle." The king was consented, and when Randolph had mounted, he called in a loud voice, "Hope!" Apparently that's what you needed to do for Hope to spread his wings. His cloak and wig fell at the same instant at the feet of the king, who, in wonder and astonishment, gazed at the handsome youth, and then with a joyful countenance exclaimed, "My good people, I have just discovered that our friend is the youth intended by the fairy as the husband of my daughter." But he confessed his age before, like, he already told you that he's not an old musician in the castle. I think the moon needs a revolution to get rid of this king. He's crazy and has weird laws, and he also doesn't abide by those except sometimes. Alas, I fear my oversight will bring upon all of us her indignation. So the king received a photo of Randolph, but she's mad at him for not visiting him, so now the king doesn't want to kill him anyway. I'm not invested. So the king is now going over to the grandmother, who was just hanging out in the corner somewhere, He's saying, I deserve your condemnation for my unjust sentence. What sentence? Did I miss something? No. O king, she replied, let this sad lesson teach you never to be hasty in your judgments. What lesson? You should have sought assistance and light from me to guide you in this important matter. I mean, there's a law already. Like, you had the law in place. Like, that's apparently your law. I don't know. I guess it's like, do whatever you want. I guess Robert Heinlein is right. The moon is a harsh mistress. So one of the consequences mentioned earlier in the book was that if he forgot to meet up with the fairy at the rock, he would forget on how to command hope. This happened now. I guess it was a delayed effect. Grief and remorse at his forgetfulness of so good a friend overcame him to such a degree that he fell into a swoon which lasted for 2 days. There's a lot of time jumping in this book. At last he saw in the distance a magnificent gate resting on clouds of azure, dipped with gold. Above this gate, in glittering letters formed of precious stones, appeared the word heaven, around which bright angels were hovering and making music with their wings. How does that look? Like, if this is a wing, am I playing music this way? It's interesting. And there issued forth music so exquisite and a light so brilliant that Randolph was thrown into an ecstasy which rendered him insensible. In this state he would have fallen into space but for the outstretched wings of Hope. Hope appeared! I like Hope. He's good. He's like the only good thing in this book. He forgot about the fairy, so he forgot Hope's name, so he couldn't control Hope. He passed out. He goes up to heaven. Through being in heaven, he's cured of his amnesia. So, no consequences. Traveling through the air for many days, he perceived the welcome glimmer of the moon's silver beams, but he dared not stop without having first visited the enchanted rock. For though he had of course lost all reckoning of time, I think we've all lost reckoning of time, he hovered for an instant over the castle, and his resolution not to delay nearly forsook him as he beheld reclining in the enchanted bower his adored princess apparently dying. I'm not invested. So instead of going to the princess, he goes back to the rock to go see the fairy, in which he is put into a slumber by the fairy. Before he opened his eyes, she mounted Hope and flew away, leaving him alone beside the lake. On awakening, as if from a horrid dream, he recognized the fairy's rendezvous and realized at once the full extent of his misfortunes. There is consequence. Yes! Finding himself covered with fragrant violets, which he knew were the tears of his benefactress, the fairy, he gathered and, kissing them, placed these tokens of her love near his heart, determining never to part with them. At that moment he beheld the lake in which was pictured the castle, and to his surprise saw the fairy borne within its enclosure on his beloved Hope. Now, with his faithful horse was gone, he had nothing left to remind him of his good fairy but the violets and the lake. I mean, the lake is kind of like a gateway into seeing people, so it's a pretty good thing. Into the crystal waters he beheld with astonishment the fairy seated by the side of the princess, uttering words which seemed to once to restore the latter to life and happiness. This moment the lake disappeared, and there stood in its place a beautiful house and grounds which Randolph found on examination to be provided with every comfort and luxury. But he himself was deprived of all sense of enjoyment. As soon as he possessed himself of what he desired to have, it assumed the shape of something distasteful to him. Flowers, when gathered by him, turned into thorns, wine into water, and every delicacy, when touched, became bread, thus forcing him to become satisfied with this simple diet. This isn't that bad of a punishment. I mean, yeah, it kind of sucks that you have to deal with bread, but you still get food. You have, like, apparently a very nice house to live in, but you have to deal with thorns instead of flowers. That's so bad. I wonder what Randolph's slaves were punished with when they, disobeyed like a minor order. Do you think they got to live in the big house? The house was inhabited by people who appeared from a distance to be most charming and agreeable, but whenever Randolph approached them, they became so hideous and disgusting that he shrank away into a solitude which forced him to gaze upon all that was delightful without the privilege of enjoying anything. Poor Randolph having to deal with the uggos. Oh, the punishment! In this place he spent his time until the day again approached for his meeting with the fairy. In the meanwhile, the bouquet of violets grew less and less. Each day one would disappear, and he would find in its place inscribed in letters of diamonds on a golden scroll the name of some virtue. First is patience, then clarity, then humility, perseverance, etc. Like etc. is also in the quote, so I'm assuming there's just like another petal of the violet that's just, it just says etc. Like the fairy ran out of words until there was but one violet left. On the eve of the day he was to meet the fairy, but also disappeared, and in its place he found a miniature of his kind friend, under which was what friend? A miniature of his kind friend. There was no friend. I mean, is it Hope? Or is the fairy the friend? Under which was written gratitude. Touching a spring in the golden case, a picture of the lovely princess was disclosed, under which was inscribed the word love. He now felt convinced that his troubles were coming to an end. Again, his troubles is he gets a really nice house, unlimited food, and just has to deal with ugly people. And that his beloved princess would be the reward of the virtues he had learned to practice in this singular place of banishment. You know, I think I just realized the princess does not have a name. She is literally just the princess. And she's just a reward for his virtues. So we have like 14 pages to go now at this point. At last the long-looked-for day arrived, and he hastened to meet the fairy, who soon appeared, and embracing him with joyful affection, commanded him to mount Hope and ascend to the moon, where the king and his daughter and all the inhabitants were awaiting him with impatience. In fact, she exclaimed, I am the grandmother of the princess, and long ago destined you for her husband. Yeah, we already know about that. This happiness would have been yours on her 18th birthday, had you not disobeyed my wishes, thus forcing me to condemn you to the castle of purification. Man, when I was at my worst, I wish I had a castle of purification. That place sounded nice. Now you are worthy to become a subject of our sinless domain, having been purified from all stains of earth. His sin is that he needs a pocket planner, not that he lied to the king and slept with his underage daughter out of wedlock, which I assuming is a thing, otherwise they wouldn't make this big of a deal about the marriage. A touch of her wand changed the somber apparel he had worn during the days of his probation into a magnificent Confederate uniform. You know what? Screw it, we're like 10 pages left in. Randolph comes back, and now we're at the wedding. After receiving the blessing of the king and queen, they were proclaimed man and wife. Thousands of trumpets sounded forth the joyful event, in the midst of which they were led to the throne prepared for them. Festivities were suddenly suspended by an unexpected event. Ooh, another one. I'm not invested. Hovering over the castle were several most singular-looking objects, which in a short time descended to the ground. From these curiously shaped affairs floated banners of red and white stripes, and in a few minutes a number of individuals issued forth carrying carpet bags, in quotes, and traps, in quotes, of all descriptions. The newcomers seemed not the least disconcerted by the crowd of peaceful-looking people who gazed so wonderingly and calmly upon them. Indeed, they made themselves so much at home that to a casual observer they would have appeared to be the owners of this fair country, and the natives seemed the intruders. Okay, she's not making it super obvious, but I'm pretty sure these are the Yankees, this weird, different race of people that Randolph was talking about. Randolph and his bride, unconscious of what was taking place outside, were receiving the congratulations and toasts of his friends as the honored Confederate, the adopted prince, and the future King of the Moon. As the uninvited guests appeared in the festival hall, But when they saw a handsome Confederate soldier seated on a throne by the side of his beautiful bride, and the magnificent and pomp surrounding him, for the first time they halted and even looked a little abashed. I'd be a little abashed too, not because of the Confederate on the throne. They came to the moon on hot air balloons. That's how I would be abashed. And everything else would just be icing on the cake. At this moment, one of the party whose grimaces and contortions had occasioned general terror, especially among the children, rushed forward exclaiming, "God bless me, if here..." Oh no. Okay, first off, I love that it's general terror among the children by just how he looks, which is not very good. And the next line is very clear on who this character is. I am not going to use an accent because holy crap, no. I will read it straight, but how it is written. God bless me if here ain't massa at last, live and well, arter all. This individual was of entirely a different appearance from the rest of the party, his skin being black and his head woolly, and as he rushed frantically towards Randolph, whom he seized in his arms, the poor princess became so alarmed that she fell into a swoon, causing for a while great confusion and dismay. Meanwhile, the guests, whose presence had caused such consternation, made themselves perfectly at home, but the people, perceiving that the woolly head appeared to be a friend of their new prince, restrained their impatience until he should explain the meaning of what they saw. I want the explanation on what I'm seeing, too. Beloved adopted citizens, this singular individual, pointing to the grinny, nope, not using that word, was an old and trusty servant belonging to my father's household, and one to whom I am greatly attached. I don't have to say anything. Do I have to say anything? That is all bad. At this moment, the exploring party commenced to run, dropping in their haste their carpet bags, from which fell numerous valuable articles. In quotations again, spoons. They just had a big carpet bag full of spoons. The surveyors reached their balloons, their means of conveyance. Right now, Cora is talking to us in the book. I have before said the people of the moon were a peaceful race, and the fairy alone exercised the prerogative of justice. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how the Moon Society works. It just sounds like a monarchy with extra steps, where the fairy / grandmother is the one with the power here. And I'm just curious, I know the princess has magic powers because she can kiss a tree and a bark falls out and turns into a doll. But does she get a magic wand at some point? Does she get a name? That's a better question. She stood there awaiting them, for her face glowing with indignation, as she exclaimed, "Ah, I have caught you at last, demons of cruelty, and I have now the power to punish you." She just now got the power to punish them. Touching the balloons with her wand, they were instantly transformed into hideous dragons. Now they could fly on dragons instead of balloons. Then she summoned Randolph to appear and pronounce sentence upon them. But this noble youth, who had learned in the Palace of Purification to know and love virtue, begged her in honor of his wedding day to release them, saying, "Beloved benefactress, did you not forgive me my base ingratitude? Permit me then to restrain my vengeance, even though these enemies have driven me from my home and deprived me of every earthly consolation." Randolph, you're a Confederate soldier and a slaver, and you're criticizing other people, depriving people of every earthly consolation. I'm not saying the North is completely fine in how Reconstruction worked. However, you're a Confederate soldier telling people that it's wrong to deprive people of freedoms. I'm going to keep coming back to it. I have to, because the book does not. And Randolph fell at the fairy's feet to intercede to these creatures, in which prayer he was joined by the princess. At the same moment, the dragons were transformed into a flock of doves. A lot is going on in this chapter. She then opened her arms to Randolph and tenderly embraced him. "Son of my heart," said she, "nobly hast thou withstood this last temptation, for it was intended only as another trial of your virtue." How many plans within plans does she have? "A respite of punishment has been granted to enable you to return and warn your people against Nemesis." Okay, so Nemesis is a name because it's capitalized. So it's like a person whose uplifted hand is ready to strike the blow that will carry destruction in its wake. I did not expect a Resident Evil crossover in my 150-year-old crappy Confederate fairy tale book. "Tell them to unshackle the race of heroes they have enslaved, that their temple of liberty may not be shattered and sow terror in their midst." Okay, I all right. I'm sorry. When you have your fairy siding with the Confederate soldier, lecturing Northerners on the moral wrongness of enslaving people. We got like 1 page left. All right. Gracefully waving her wand, a number of gorgeous and magnificent balloons appeared, in which the explorers gladly departed in the midst of the acclamations and rejoicings of the inhabitants of the moon. I would have rather just ride the dragons. When last heard from the party had landed at the Central Park, but instead of trying to convert their erring people, they were making large fortunes by carrying lovers beyond the clouds to be united in the bonds of matrimony. They have never again undertaken to invade the moon. Ooh. Wait until the late 60s. I'm at the end. So that's Princess of the Moon, a Confederate fairy tale. And here I am, 3 days after the last recording, just to explain the facial hair. So that was Princess of the Moon. And it's obvious that the story isn't exactly read to kids anymore. At least I hope not. Not just because of the racist caricatures, but also it's just not a very good story. I spared you guys the amount of prose used in this story. It is a drag, despite being only like 70 pages long. I also edited out like 10 minutes of me mispronouncing words. They are very indefatigable people. I couldn't find out if this book was even all that popular during its publication. It was preserved by the University of North Carolina, where my scanned copy came from, so there's that. This book is one of the earliest examples, not just when it was written chronologically, but also the target audience of the book for the Lost Cause myth. I said before in the beginning that this is a country, the Confederacy, that lost a war and then was humiliated by the victors. The people in power lost that power and watched everything that they built and fought for taken away. This book was written for children born during or right after the Civil War by someone that benefited from the way of life before the war. I kept bringing up slavery in the video because Cora Ives not only tried to brush it away in the story, but tried to reframe it to make the Northerners the true slave owners, while an actual slave in the story was just a servant, a hired help. Yeah, and the use of racial slurs on him as a term of endearment was not fun to read. The Lost Cause was, and still is, an attempt to retell the Civil War and the years following up to it as a war to preserve Southern freedom and states' rights. There's a joke that Margaret Mitchell, author of Gone with the Wind, used to make when talking about her family and their recontextualizing of what the Civil War was fought for and the pride of the South. She would say that she thought the South actually won the war until she was like 10. Now, if you are a Southerner who didn't really like my little tirade in the beginning and actually made it this far in the video, I like you. Thanks for sticking it out. And second, I don't think you're stupid. I don't think you're dumb. I don't think I'm better than you for shoving the slavery narrative throughout the video. I think you were given wrong info. I think the people in charge didn't want to bring up what they were fighting for. So they tried to, and succeeded, since we're still having this conversation 150 years later. I mean, historians aren't. They know. But we're still having the conversation. And I know it's a little condescending to hear from a northerner, all of this. So, I'm from New Jersey. Born and raised. I love this state for stupid reasons. Even got it tattooed on my leg. And New Jersey was a slave-based agricultural economy. Longer than any other northern state. We were the very last to write up an emancipation law in 1804. The very last. And even then, it was a gradual emancipation that eventually freed men and women, eventually at different ages, but left the children born before the law as lifetime apprentices. By the time the Civil War broke out, there were still 14 slaves registered in the state. Lincoln lost the New Jersey vote in both elections. This state, and I love it, is full of stubborn, proud people who also rather sugarcoat the past than drudge it up. I do want to leave this video recommending some other books that I found in my research that I talked about in the beginning. The first one is 300 Years Hence by Mary Griffith. It's about a man waking up in the future and finding fast-traveling cars and trains, slavery is abolished, and women are given the right to vote. It was published 30 years before the Civil War. I mean, it's dated and has references to political figures at the time, but it was a good read. The other is Man's Rights, or How Would You Like It, by Annie Denton Cridge. The narrator finds herself transported to Mars, where the gender roles are reversed. And she finds herself then in the future, where there is a woman president, and the House and Senate are represented by an equal number of people, both men and women. That was published in 1870. The last book is a modern one that isn't actually part of this research. It's called Escape from Camp 14. It's about a man named Shin Dong-hyo. I probably mispronounced that. He escaped from a prison camp in North Korea. And I mention this book because there is a great chapter in it. And it talks about when North Koreans managed to defect out of North Korea into China. One of the first things that they do is get re-educated about the history of the Korean War. Because their whole lives, they were told false information. And during these classes, people are mad, frustrated, in disbelief at first. And even after choosing to flee from the Kim dictatorship, they still are defensive about what they've been taught as kids. Take care, everyone.